Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights is often the footing for those taking a stand for their right to use psychedelics. Consider churches of Santo Daime, houses of Rastafari, and many indigenous societies that are protected by this universal human right, freedom of religion. For many of us in more secular societies, however, can we really honestly say that our use of psychedelics are essential to our practice of religious belief? Well, perhaps some of us can, but even then, the burden of proof lies on us to fit the standard definitions for a valid religion, and this creates problems. For example, as Charlotte Walsh points out in the lecture given in 2019, there have been cases where Rasta's freedom to manifest and practice their religion, for example, was deemed a threat to public safety, order, health, or morals, and thus subject to Section 3 of Article 18, which allows for limitation of religious freedom in such cases. So besides all of this, what about those of us who are not particularly religious but still benefit from psychedelics? Where do we stand? Well, let's take a look at the article again. Article 18, Section 1, everyone shall have the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. Note also that the caveat in Section 3, which allows for the curtailing of Article 18, refers specifically to freedom to manifest one's religion or beliefs. It does not mention the first two freedoms, namely freedom of thought and freedom of conscience. Now, why is this? Perhaps because freedom of thought and conscience is at the very heart of Western secular law, and therefore not just enshrined in the Universal Bill of Rights, but in nearly all democratic constitutions at the national level. Major philosophers whose thought laid the foundations for the modern Western political and economic order placed great emphasis upon freedom of thought. Spinoza, Locke, Voltaire, Mill, to name just a few. Now, Spinoza died in the 17th century, Locke and Voltaire in the 18th century. Even the youngest mentioned, John Stuart Mill, died in 1873. So let's go back to the decades immediately following Mill's death in 1873 and see what could have changed from then concerning notions of freedom of thought. Well, in the 1880s and 1890s, people in the West began experimenting with peyote, and chemists isolate, identify, and synthesize mescaline for the first time. So now, just as in the past, books were used as a tool that one could use to change the way that one thinks, now the modern Western scientific person was discovering psychedelic substances as tools, which also, like books, can be used to change the way that one thinks. So were there any other tools discovered at the same time, which, like books, could be used to change the way that people think? Well, it's also in the 1880s and 1890s that the advertising industry comes into its own, with the modern advertising poster, and spawns a new field of crowd psychology and mental manipulation. By the 1970s, the average American consumer saw around 500 ads per day. In 2020, that number has reached over 5,000 ads per day. Advertising agencies now use fMRI brain imaging to hack even deeper into consumers' minds and change their brain chemistry to make them think that they need to buy a product. Well, probably most of us have experienced having ads targeted at us personally based on the harvesting of our metadata, as we enter a brave new world of not just neuroimaging, but psychopharmacology, brain implants, and brain-machine interfaces. Enter cognitive liberty, a term coined by Sentencia and Bois and defined as the right of each individual to think independently and autonomously, to use the full power of his or her mind, and to engage in multiple modes of thought. This can be boiled down to a dual right with two aspects, outlining both a negative and a positive obligation, the right to use and the right to refuse neuroenhancements. Interestingly, this is reflected in Timothy Leary's two commandments for the molecular age back in 1960s. Number 1, thou shalt not alter the consciousness of thy fellow man. And number 2, thou shalt not prevent thy fellow man from altering his consciousness. Sentencia, a neuroethicist, speaks of the escalation and the growth of neurobioinfocognotech, and says cognitive liberty is a term that updates notions of freedom of thought for the 21st century. by taking into account the power that we now have, and increasingly will have, to monitor and manipulate cognitive function. Cognitive liberty is every person's right to think independently, to use the full spectrum of his or her mind, and to have autonomy over his or her own brain chemistry. Cognitive liberty concerns the ethics and legality of safeguarding one's own thought processes, and by necessity, one's electrochemical brain states. The individual, not corporate or government interests, should have sole jurisdiction over the control and/or modulation of his or her brain states and mental processes. There is thus a growing push for legislature concerning freedom of thought to be updated and extended to embrace the right to mental self-determination, mental autonomy, and mental independence. In fact, it is increasingly argued that cognitive liberty, more properly, is the very principle underlying the right to freedom of thought. Check out the links in the description for further research into this most important field of human rights for the 21st century.